draft. There you go.
Yeah. Next.
All right. The next topic, which was poo-pooed for the end of yesterday, is
Only Serena. I can't hear.
So we're going to continue the conversation about our strategic priorities. I'm hoping everyone had a chance to look at the memo. There's a lot in there that I'm not going to go over, but if there is anything, but there's going to be an opportunity, if there's something in there you have questions about, you disagree with the recommendation, I think there'll be an opportunity here for us to talk about it. In terms of the process, we had a strategic planning retreat in June, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about strategic priorities, identifying, and we also did a straw poll to get a sense of where the group was at that time. One thing to note about the straw poll, well, actually, let me pause. After that, I spent some time talking with President-elect Abel, President Clark, and talked about where we should go from here. And I think ultimately we agreed that because we are looking at these currently on sort of a 1-year horizon, which if you've read the memo, you know that my recommendation is ultimately we move away from that approach. However, right now we are looking at them in sort of a 1-year horizon, that ultimately it should be next year's board, the FY24 board, that adopts these priorities. And so my plan is to come back in November with something that hopefully is ready to be approved. Obviously, there can be some tweaks, but we wanted to spend some time here getting to a point where we can bring something that's ready for approval in November so that we can get going. Because if we spend half the year adopting the priorities, it doesn't leave very much time to actually execute the priorities. So at the retreat, we had broad participation from senior staff, from the officers, from governors who will be outgoing. And you can see sort of where the will of the group was in the memo. But obviously that's not the group that's going to be voting on these. So I think what I'm hoping is that we can specifically gather some input from the folks that will be voting on these. So I'm going to ask participation of the elects to really figure out what we can bring back in November that will be ready to go. So there's some discussion questions at the end of the memo, and I want to start there. So the first question is, I want to check to make sure, do we have consensus that we should really be striving to adopt no more than 3 strategic priorities? And I guess I'll say, if you disagree with that, I would love to know. And otherwise, I'm going to assume it's the consensus.
See that.
I disagree. I mean, again, looking at what we have, there are 9, starting at page 326, there are 9 outlined strategic priorities. And I don't believe that we were presented with the idea of bringing it down to just 3 in June, because then we could have had more of a conversation. Now, again, I have no problem with tiering them or prioritizing, but I'm just going to pick number 6, establish a process for WSBA program review. I don't think that if it's not a top 3, that it shouldn't be happening. And I don't think that that's there. So I guess my question back is, if we narrowed it to 3, what would happen to the other 6? Because again, you're still going to, I mean, like, again, you're doing a program review. You told us about it. So if all of a sudden we don't make it one of the top 3, I really don't think you're going to just say, screw it. I mean, sorry, forget it. We're not going to do it anymore. We're going to put a pin in it. So
correct.
What is the impact of us going to 3?
Right. Great question. And this is one of the things that our facilitator was pushing and recommending to us, is that, basically the idea, if you make everything a priority, nothing's a priority. So one of the things that I've tried to articulate here is that the Bar Association does a huge array of things, right? It's a complicated organization. There are all kinds of work that we're doing in all kinds of areas, and none of that is going to stop unless you tell us to. And so you'll see on some of these, I have said, and that one is one in particular, I'm going to keep doing this until you tell me to stop. So arguably, you might say, well, that's been operationalized. We no longer need to identify it as sort of a priority. I think the recommendation from John was that when you're thinking about prioritizing things, it's not that you're saying all the other stuff isn't important. What you're saying is, among all of this very important stuff, this is what we think needs a particular push right now. And I think you definitely could say, no, we want more than 3. I think what we all need to acknowledge then, though, is that that'll be less time that we can devote to those. So the narrower we can get, the more effort we can put into those particular things. So I would say any of this work that's already happening, it will continue, even if it's not identified as a priority, but we will be putting extra emphasis on whatever you identify as a priority.
And then my follow-up to that, if I can, is if we do go to 3 and they require a fiscal support to really make that a top priority, because it's going to require 72 more people to do it, what is the plan on how to address that, since we just adopted our budget?
Yeah. So this is one of the very clear challenges of having 1-year priorities, is that they don't inform the budget. So that being said, we do have some avenues. We can always amend the budget. We have substantial reserves. So we do have the ability to fund something if we wanted to. And again, even though we're sort of setting these on an annual basis, we'll be starting the FY25 budget process in a matter of months. So hopefully we can start doing the work to assess if it will cost money. And if it does, we could either go the path of a budget amendment, or we can build it into the FY25 budget.
Yeah. So to the budgeting concern or the thought, some of the things that we deal with don't really have a major impact, budget impact.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like some things we sometimes do may not yield immediate results or immediate solutions, or there'll be kind of an issue that we continue to kind of monitor or try to address without a lot of movement. And sometimes, you can focus on something, you can have a success, and then you don't need a continuing budget or a very small monitoring kind of a focus or attention. So, you can, particularly if you're not kind of cognizant of the nature of the issue or the problem and the proposed course of action, you can lock in hey, we need a 10% of our budget assigned to this, and then in reality it might drop to 2% after year 3 or something like that, maybe. Or it may be a balloon. It may be a bigger issue that's masked, or becomes uncovered, or some future event, requires a greater involvement or input or resource allocation to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it seems to me as though that there's some, I would hesitate to say hazard, but some issue with kind of projecting out into the future of what we have right now as our existing financial or resource commitment priorities, and the amount of attention, time, committee, particularly among the board members, by the staff, which is a paid for resource out of budgeted. But the board of governors could spend 40% of our time on something, but it's a 5% staff bandwidth allocation, and that type of a thing, maybe. So it seems to me as though there's some uncertain budget and resource commitments, depending on what the nature of the priority is. And so because we have X number of priorities, those could be reshuffled, and maybe reshuffled periodically throughout a year, depending on the events that transpire, the current events basically driving our agendas or our focus or our attention. So it's strategic planning, is important, and certainly having, Ben's subject to training and education on the subject, and been involved in it on many different organizations and levels. It's fraught with a lot of ongoing buffeting from current events, essentially.
Yeah. And just to be clear, none of these are currently tied to budget requests, which I think can be both a pro or a con, depending on how you look at it. And I think along with that, that again gets back to the prioritization, because if we're saying that we're going to do these things with existing staff, we have to recognize that's a limited resource. So for example, I spent a lot of my time this year on program review. That's time that I couldn't spend on the space issue or something else. And so I think it's even more important to prioritize if we're saying we're going to use existing capacity.
Well, thanks, Tara. If I could just chime in briefly on this subject, I do want to reinforce what Tara mentioned about the idea of all of these priorities, continuing on into the coming year. If we do narrow it down to a finite number, 3 or 4, whatever that might be, it doesn't mean the important work on these other items just stop. Instead, it's kind of that power 10 concept that we talked about with Mr. Phelps. I will say also, just very much from a kind of a selfish point of view, some feedback from this board about what is really, really important to you will be helpful for me in the coming year as I'm thinking about how to use my time. So if we're able to get to that point, I think that would be helpful. And then the last thing I would point out is, as you all know, this is a dynamic board where individual board members have a lot of authority and power to bring items onto the agenda. So if something is not selected as one of the top 3 or 4, whatever number it's going to be, I encourage you to come directly to me and say, Hunter, I've got an idea for, increasing member engagement in WSBA's volunteer community. If that's not one of the top 3 or 4 that's chosen, because I'm going to put it on the agenda. Might steer it to try and get it to the most appropriate meeting and try and have it after it's appropriately fleshed out, and we can have the right people in the right room at the right time. But it's going to get on the agenda. So if you've got something that you want to bring forward, bring it. So anyway, hope that's helpful.
Thanks. I guess my question, or a question for the next board to figure out when they're adopting this, I look at whatever those priorities are, and I wonder, are they selected because you believe they can be accomplished in a year? And if they aren't accomplished in a year, what does that mean for other things that are, for example, on the list?
Mm-hmm.
And if they are accomplished, do you go back and you add a new thing? And I'm just trying to tease out, what happens. I don't know if the driver of the 3 is, well, we can do this in a year, or is the driver of the 3, we can make substantial progress and this is going to remain, one of the top 3 until we've either done it or dumped it. But I'm just kind of curious how that would work, but I think that's a real question for the next board when you all take that up to adopt it. What does it mean having adopted it in terms of, yes, some of the other things will come into play or you'll continue to do those things, but what will be your measurement?
Mm-hmm.
How and when will you know you achieved it? And if you haven't, what then? Do you carry that on because that is still a priority, or again, in a way, do you drop it because, well, we didn't do it in the year? So,
I mean, my recommendation is that the time period should not be very important at all. I think what should be is, what is the priority? When you look around, what is the priority? And one thing that we talk about internally, because we also internally have operational priorities, and we set them annually, but I don't think we need to feel like a failure if something takes more than a year. These timelines are largely arbitrary unless you have a real deadline that you have to meet. And I think sometimes they take more than a year because we adopted too many. And at the end of the day, for me, I think about the work that we do in the bar. I sort of think there's 3 chunks. The biggest chunk is the day-to-day work. This is all the work we got to do, answering questions, certifying MCLE, all these things. And that takes up the vast majority of everybody's time. We also need to carve out capacity to deal with the unexpected. The website's going to crash. There's going to be an issue. And we need to have time and capacity for that. But we also need to carve out time and capacity to innovate, be strategic, problem solve. And so what we're really saying is, with that little bit of time we've carved out, how do you want us to use it? And some of this stuff, once it sort of gets, like, let's take the STAR committee's work, okay? I think looking at rural practice is hugely important. And arguably that's sort of become the day-to-day work now of that committee, the staff that work with that committee. And so maybe there's value in still calling it out as like the most important thing we're facing right now. Or maybe we can say, you know what, that seems like it's operationalized. Let's let that do its thing. Or maybe it's like, Well, it's sort of operationalized, but we still think it needs some extra push. So we still want you to use some of that time to push on this.
So I would hope that the reason I asked that question is because this topic is steps for FY24 strategic priorities. And so I would hope, and this is just my suggestion, that when the next Board of Governors gets to the place of adopting, you also adopt what the timeline is going to be for each of those priorities, as opposed to just kind of having the heading FY24 and not going in recognizing how long that might take and give it the time that it needs to take, as opposed to, well, we're not going to do that, but if we don't get it done in FY24, yeah, you can say, well, that doesn't mean it's a fail, but in a way it becomes a fail if you didn't, going in, have an idea about how long you believed it was going to take to do it in the first place. So you can measure your progress against that. And that doesn't have to be for each one of those. But I think it's important going in to say, and this is the time this is going to take to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. President. As ED Nevitt knows, I'm not a big fan of 1 year priorities. It just doesn't help. And some of the priorities that we also outline here, they are operationals. They are operational priorities that really is not directly under the purview of the Board of Governors. That's, I believe, the executive director and the leadership team can pursue. So that's for that. But for those priorities that are within the confines of the Board of Governors to decide, here is my recommendation. I think at the minimum, this should be 2 to 3 years priorities, because if you don't measure it, it didn't happen. How can you measure a priority within 1 year? By the way, this is not going to be adopted today. It's going to be adopted in November, if possibly. It might not even be adopted in November. It might drag on to the new year. By the time we adopt this, we are already 4 months or 3 months into the year. And so the ED Nevitt is just getting us to focus on the priority. Just tell me what I need to focus on. By the time we get to the decision making, we are already halfway into the term, and we are thinking about FY 2025. So that is my frustration with the idea of setting 1 year priorities. Ideally, I would encourage setting 3 to 5 year priorities. Have a subcommittee of the Board of Governors focus on outline, working with together with leadership team, work on the deliverables. What are the expectations from these goals? What do you hope to achieve in the next 2 years? And by the way, as far as I'm concerned, this priority speaks to values. It should be unmoored from the budgetary conversation. Because every time we look at the dollar sign, we run away from our values. And that's a wrong approach, as Governor Williams-Root used to remind us all the time. You have to stick to your values. What are your values? Your priority speaks to your values. If your values is that you are concerned about DEI, let it be. If your values is about you want to build a building, let it be that. Let's focus on what. I would rather not have us link these priorities to budgets, because speak to your values first, and then when we come back for budget retreats, we are having a conversation. Here is our values. How do we fund these values? That should be the way. The cart should not go before the horse. So my recommendation is that if we need to do this at all, let's do it in the 2 to 3 years or maximum 5 years priorities, looking ahead. And then let a subset of the Board of Governors and the leadership team work to outline. This is how we did it at the Access to Justice Board. Let them work on what are the deliverables. What do you want to accomplish in the next 2 years? And what are those things that we should be able to see that from these priorities, we've been able to accomplish this, accomplish this, accomplish this. Okay, then we can check. You don't have to accomplish everything, but at least set a measure. Because if you don't set something you're going to use to measure the priorities, you're just trying to send a message that would never be delivered. To be delivered, you have to set me priorities and you're messaging to the staff that this is our values and we want these deliverables in 2 years, in 3 years, in 5 years. That to me is the minimum that we should be doing. But for me, to answer the questions, I want us to take away anything that is operational from these goals in the first place. If we take that away, and of course, ED reports to the board with regards to what she's doing operationally, because when we start talking about operational issues on the board, it's really not a best use of our time, and we have done that in the past, and it does not work. So my encouragement to this board, and I really want the outgoing governors to be able to participate because you've seen these organizations over the years. I want you to be able to, before you go today, to let us know what you think, looking forward from your experiences, what do you want to see? And I want the governors-elect, so that when we come back, the governors-elect have been through this process now for almost 2 or 3 months. So they will be better prepared to be able to craft a future for these organizations based on those priorities. So I might be in the minority on this issue, but that's just my viewpoint. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. Okay, so Brian had a hand up and then it was down.
I'm going to wait until we get down to another question.
Okay, great. Okay, the next, Brian, I'm in you after.
Thank you, President Clark. So I like the concept of multi-year. I've worked in enough organizations to know why single year are difficult. But I personally, in my own head, think of last year as the stolen year, where I don't honestly remember anything we did. I mean, obviously we passed a budget but ethos dominated the entire year. And that wasn't what was the plan at the start of that year. And I think that we have 3-year terms and we don't meet on a regular basis. And if I were sitting as a governor-elect today, I would be thinking, it's like, okay, well, what are my priorities? What do I want to get accomplished? Well, I maybe got elected with an idea about reforming character and fitness in my head. That was one thing. But then other things came to fruition. Being a liaison to sections that I was never a part of, being exposed to members and issues, STAR committee being one of them. That's never something that had ever crossed my mind beforehand. And I don't know what the answer is, but I will tell you that I've also consistently been absolutely livid and that being hamstrung of a promise from a board to not raise dues for 5-6 years. And it's like, for us to do a 5-year, just like Danger Will Robinson, because how do we know? I mean, imagine if we were sitting in 2016 and we would never have known COVID was coming. We wouldn't have said that it was essential for us to invest in learning how to do hybridized meetings and yeah. And so that I'm reticent to support a more than even just like a 2-year, like a biannual, because I want the new governor-elects that are coming in and those, like Governor Dresden, who I think just stepped up, who's going to continue on for another term, to be able to have something that they're working towards to accomplish. And if you come in to an organization that says, here's our goals, and we're not touching them we're not slated to touch these for another 2 years, that could feel defeating. So because again, I mean, I really have felt defeated in any conversation about the budget because we're living with this promise from a board from 2018 that I wasn't part of that has dictated where we're going. So I understand the need of not having too many, and I'm all for winnowing it down, but I also don't want to take away from the people who are going to come on next year or the year after to have their own reasons. You know, because again, if we're seeking out applicants to run for the Board of Governors, people are usually going to have a reason why. And it's not just to sit in a meeting and hear how the status of the priorities picked by a board in 2023 are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my fear.
One thing I want to add, and it's potentially was a little buried in the memo, but so the Long Range Strategic Planning Council appointed a subcommittee, which is Governor Angelville, this guy, Governor Ottawale,
This guy,
myself, and Chief Disciplinary Counsel Doug Enday. And so we have been working on a revised charter to that group, which would really change it quite a bit. It would change its membership, it would change its focus, and it would really reorganize it as a group that's focused on developing a strategic plan for the board to vote on. So the way I'm approaching this right now is we will work to bring that forward. In the meantime, I'm assuming my marching orders are to continue to follow this existing process that we have. So I say that, one, if you want to sort of redirect and say, no, stop this, let's just focus on developing a long-term strategic plan, you could give me that direction. Alternatively, there will be another day to debate the wisdom of WSBA having a long-term strategic plan, and I think it'll be when we bring that charter forward.
Thank you. I'll be brief here. With regard to Alex's comment about kind of what are these, I'll tell you just from my own perspective, I view this list of potential priorities as options for this board to choose among from to exercise judgment in telling us about what the priorities are for the organization at this time right now, really without regard to a time frame. So I view it as direction for us, being an exercise of judgment from the board about what is important at this time. As far as kind of the time range for goals, I also tend to like the idea of longer term goals. At some point, I think we're going to have to rip that Band-Aid off and do it. I think it's more feasible and likely to work in light of the fact that we now have the possibility of reelected governors. I think it's going to be a very interesting injection of some institutional memory from board members. Of course, we have the institutional memory from staff as well, which is invaluable. And then the last part is that the idea, at least, or part of the appeal, at least in my mind, of reducing it to a specific number, and I'm not necessarily wedded to 3, but 3, 4, some manageable number, is that it's really empowering for myself, for the executive director, for the past president, for our president-elect, when we're talking with outside stakeholders about what is the organization doing. We can say, our board has told me that these are the priorities. And it's something for me to look at in the course of the year. Frankly, how am I doing? Am I spending my time on these issues? So my thoughts there. Thank you.
Alex.
So I'm just making these comments for what to do in the future. First of all, in terms of time, I would say actually, whatever the priority is, don't go in saying it's got to be 2 or 3. Actually, take some time and drive that out. There may be some priorities that are going to be able to be done in a year.
Yeah.
Because it's really just getting it operationally going. So, do that on a case by case basis. And of course, the other thing, and I was thinking about what Governor Williams-Ruth said about the lost year. I have a saying that, that life happens while you're making plans. And so, for example, in that year where COVID became an issue for everyone, to me, there was no question, but that you had to really focus on that because it had so many implications. It had implications about how we do work. It had implications about our workforce. It had implications, not only within the organization, but outside of the organization. But I also think about some of the good things that have happened. And I just want to remind folks that there was a time, right? We were in the conference center and we had some machine in the middle of the table. And so if you weren't present, you were really kind of absent unless Rex or somebody knew you were on the line. And then we would talk like Charlie's Angels. We would, talk to the box and the box would talk to us. Now we're able to have hybrid meetings. We're able to come together, but people can participate in our meetings without having to spend a whole day, or only those who could come to Seattle or wherever you were meeting. So there were things that came out of that. But just understand and give yourself some room for things that happen. And oh, by the way, whatever you do in terms of whatever that timeline looks like, please, not passively, but actively, I'd say at least 3 times a year, or at least twice a year, at a meeting, do an assessment about how it's going with certain priorities, so that those priorities remain front and center in your mind. That yes, we said we were going to do those things, and we don't wait until almost the end of that time period to say, oh, well, and either there was reasons why not, et cetera, but keep those alive and in people's consciousness that we said these are the priorities. So how are we doing on those priorities? And then I think it'd be great because you will also be able to then, talk about things where life has happened and your plans changed and why, et cetera. But so that's the thing, not to just kind of let them drift. And only kind of at the last second do you say, oh, yeah, we had these priorities. What were they, by the way? And how are we doing on them?
Okay. I think I'd like to move to the next question. So I get the sense maybe there's not a lot of clear consensus for like 3, but maybe most people are aligned with we do need to narrow. So my next question was, so member wellness. So when we did the straw poll at the retreat, member wellness only got two votes. But I think it's possible that is because when the board took up the issue in May, the board took action and said, this is a priority. We're adding this as a priority. So I just want to confirm my assumption is that is already decided to be a priority for next year. And that's how I will proceed unless people understood that differently. Okay.
Should I say thumbs up?
Okay. So the next question, and this is probably the meatier one, is as you can see, we have 9 priorities that we discussed. Now, when we did the straw poll, only a few of them really got the vast majority of votes. So the top, we've got develop a strategic plan, 14 votes, assess technology related opportunities and threats, 11 votes, support rural practice, 9 votes, and increase WSBA's commitment to DEI, 8 votes. And then it kind of goes down from there. So what I would like to see is if it is possible that we can narrow the list of what you would like me to bring forward in November, not necessarily narrow it to 3, but I'd like to do some additional work on what these look like, what the timing is going to be. And I'd like to know what additional information you want. And I would prefer not to do that for things that don't have a lot of support. So my thought was that we could do a quick straw poll. I'd like to focus on the folks that will be voting in the next fiscal year.
In November.
In November, right. So So not the butterflies and not me and not the folks who are going to be leaving, but really hear from the folks who will be voting next year.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do is just quickly go through and get a show of hands, and and just sort of see if you think this is in the running to be one of your top three. Put your hand up, and I want to sort of see where we have the critical mass. And it may be that there's a lot of interest in all of them, and if that's the case, then that's how we'll proceed.
Can I ask a clarification
Yes.
question?
Yes.
Number 6, establish a process for WISBA program review.
Mhm.
In your opinion, do you think that is more operational than work? If it's operational, I think it should be probably a priority for the executive leadership team and not necessarily a priority for us. Of course, when the report gets to us, we have to act on it.
Yeah.
But I need you to clarify that.
Yeah. You know, if the line between operations and policy was black and white, I would be a much happier person. I do think there's a significant operational piece to this. And in that, ultimately, I think it's largely my responsibility to review effectiveness of programs and then bring that forward to the board for the board to decide what to do in terms of budget, et cetera. So yes, I think there's a large part of that is operational. And as you can see in my paragraph here, I said, you may not need to identify this as an organizational priority. So I would say you don't need to make it a priority. It's going to continue. But, you know, you all get to decide. Yes.
Before I vote in the straw poll, what exactly does it mean for it to be a priority? Does that mean we talk about it at every meeting? Is there a task force? Is there a work group? What does it actually mean for something to be a priority for the board?
Excellent question. I don't think it means that you talk about it at every meeting. I think, although the board is going to set the direction in terms of saying right now, these are the most pressing issues that we think need focus. But that doesn't mean you all are going to carry out all the work. But I also think it varies by topic. Some of these, the answer may be to create a task force. Some of them, the answer may be for the board to spend some time talking about it. And some of them, it may be my team and I are going to do a bunch of work and just come back to you with a report. So I think it varies. And that's part of why I'd like to narrow this list, because we can give you some more detail on what we think it looks like in November. And the fewer things we have to develop that plan for, I think the better. So I think it varies. But what it really means to me, and I think Hunter spoke to this a little bit too, is I have myself and my team and the staff and the volunteers, frankly, and all of our entities, they have a little bit of capacity beyond all their day-to-day work to do other things. And I feel like what you're telling us is, here's how we'd like to see you prioritize that time. These are the 3. If you've got extra time, you should be focusing on rural practice because that's the most pressing issue today, or whatever it is. Okay.
Okay, so this year, I mean, okay. Okay. I was awesome because you all told me, focus on like 3 or 4 things, and that helped me a lot. So that's why too. So yeah. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to go through them each one, and then I think just show of hands will be helpful. So the first one is develop a strategic plan for the future of WISBA space. This one had the most interest at the retreat. One of the things I identified is that, and this really gets back to some of our conversation yesterday. If we feel like we're just moving forward with renting and that's it, this probably doesn't need to be a strategic priority. On the other hand, if we think, no, we still need a long-term vision for what we're going to do long-term, then probably this should be, because that's going to take some effort. So show of hands among the people who will be voting on next year's board, who would like to see this come back in November? Okay. Yeah, okay. 1. Okay, the next one is it's assessing technology related opportunities and threats. Okay, we've already got hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7,
Oh, yeah.
8.
Sorry, I'm sleeping.
Okay.
Hey, we were not talking about buying a building, so I.
Okay, got those. Yes, I think so. I got a lot. Oh no, I got 9. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, supporting rural practice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7.
There's online two Marys.
Oh, sorry, so 8. Did Mary vote for any other ones yet?
I'm not sure if she did.
Mary, I wasn't getting you online. Did you vote for either the space issue or the technology one?
I voted for the technology one, not the space issue.
Okay. 10. Yep. Yep. Okay, next one. Before you put your hands up, I want to highlight what I wrote here. Increasing with the commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. So one of the things we talked about is, as it's written, it's sort of just restating what's essentially like one of our guiding principles. And so our recommendation is when we bring it back, that we work to refine it in terms of some specificity. Okay. Now hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Go 2.
I got those. Yeah. And did I get? Okay.
Oh, you only vote, no.
No, I didn't say that. I
No,
didn't say that.
she did not give us that.
I didn't say that. But I think if you want to restrain yourself, that might help in terms of limiting this.
They all got 11 votes.
It's true.
Exactly.
Like, just on our.
Yeah.
Okay. The next one is determine a budget philosophy and a long-term financial plan. And you'll see here I've captured some of the recommendations around looking at the budget year and timing of license fee and all those things. 1, 2, 3. 3. Next up is establish a process for WISPA program review. That's it.
I told you.
Okay.
Steps.
Next one is ensure access to justice and service to the public. This one also I'm suggesting if we do it, we need to make it a little more specific. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mhm. Okay, next one is increase member engagement in WISPA's volunteer community. Okay, 0. And then I'm not going to ask about member well-being because we
there's
already
one by
established.
Mary.
Oh, sorry. There's one by Mary. Okay. Because we've already established that's included. So my sense based on this is that I will bring forward with more detail and thought, assessing technology related opportunities and threats, which was the highest priority here, supporting rural practice, increasing WISPA's commitment to DEI. And I would also suggest, because it was right on the cusp, that I bring back ensuring access to justice and service to the public, and we'll flesh those out a little more. Oh, and that's going to be on there already. Yeah.
Can I request that when it comes back, that you and the leadership team prepare something like a benchmark that we can for action or action plan that we can use to judge, did we take these steps within this 1 year?
Yeah.
Because that's very important.
So that leads to my next question, which was, what do you want to see in November? So action plan, is there anything else that people really want to see?
Yeah, you've both kind of touched on something we used in it. Hunter would certainly be familiar with this one, what they refer to as a POAM, plan of action and milestones. And that's pretty standard, military speak or Navy speak, at least anyway. And because I mean, then you've got, what the plan looks like, and then you go, when this is expected to happen, when the next thing, and then presumably through completion, or whatever, through, routine monitoring, et cetera, whatever.
Thank you. Oh, there's a hand up.
Okay.
Brent's going to.
I'm sorry, Brent.
Okay. So none of the things that I voted for made it through. And it's not like, and I didn't vote for DEI because I don't think that's going to go anywhere. And I think it's been a priority and it's going to continue to be a priority. But when it actually comes to policy, the fact that, we don't have a fiscal policy that's actually fleshed out and only 2 people supported it. So this is, this is always the thing. So it's like, so is there really any reason for me to come to Board of Governors meetings for the next year? Because the issues that I care about aren't now a priority by anyone else. So, I mean, this is where I was talking about going through, because again, the things that were being supported, we're not with, we even heard the deans talking about Chat GPT and AI. That is now going to be a forefront in the legal community and how they're going to be dealing with it. Do we really think that the bar isn't going to, I just think that we have narrowed ourselves down to things that were going to be happening anyway and maintaining the status quo, but not actually looking at, so I guess we're going to keep doing the status quo when it comes to not actually having a fiscal policy plan for how we are going to be managing the association on a long-term strategic plan. So I feel disappointed in where the support is versus where things that aren't actually already being done.
One thing I will say is I do think from an operational perspective, we are interested in looking at the question around the fiscal year and some related budget things. And I think there's a big portion of that is operational. So I hope that we will still bring forward some things that will be responsive to some of the concerns you've raised on that one, at least.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, since it needs a lot of fleshing out, if you want it, I am more than happy to help try to flesh out the ensure access to justice instead of the public one, because it's one I voted for.
Yeah.
Okay. You are asking what else do you need to bring back? I will be interested in the resources that is needed for any of these priorities. Do we have capacity? Do we have enough resources as is? Or do we need to increase resources in the areas that are identified?
Thank you. Anything else? No.
Just to put things in context, or at least give what I like to believe is my wisdom. As I lead the board, regardless of what
My phone.
Regardless of whatever the priorities are, I'm hoping you all recognize that these have to do with kind of the board's priorities, but then there's a whole set of other things that will come to you that have to do with all of the various committees, councils, commissions, et cetera, who need your review and consent to go forward, which is a big responsibility. Outside of this, the work that's the normal, actual work that still the board has to do, and deciding what to do about, I was talking with Governor Couch last night about his votes that went down, and I kind of looked at him and said, well, sometimes you send things up. And sometimes you have to do it more than once to gain support for the idea. So I would hope that you would all stay totally engaged and don't get so focused on this vote or that vote, because other things come up and you're called upon to serve, and serve not only the board and its priorities, but the association and the regulatory functions that are given to the association.
Yeah. Thanks, Howard. Matt, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to say that this is for Tara, but just that I'm happy to help work on the technology proposal as well. And I believe Sunitha is, and I don't want to volunteer Jordan for anything, but I know he's interested in that. But he's already working on the other thing, and Serena too. And I've heard Kari, but I know she's not here.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for this. Let's go on to.
Did Brian have something?
Oh, I'm sorry, Brian. Did you have something to add? Or
No.
you gonna-
The answer to my question really wanted
Yeah, Tara answered my question when she answered Governor Williams' Ruth question about, so what's going to happen to this strategic planning council type thing? So I got the answer. I figured that was the answer, but I wanted to hear it again.
Thanks, Brian.